Well, good afternoon. It's an honor to welcome you here to this Friday talk held on a Wednesday. And in this week, it's to recognize yesterday, which was Holocaust Memorial Day. And on 27th of January, 1945, the concentration camp Auschwitz was liberated. And Holocaust Memorial Day falls every year on the 27th of January. And it's because of that and that we wanted to schedule this Friday talk on this day, this evening. My name's Nathan Eddy, and I'm the half-time chaplain here at Mansfield College. And with half my time, I also work in Jewish-Christian dialogue and in Holocaust education. We and I have led study tours to Poland, to Auschwitz, to Warsaw, and it's my privilege today to stand in for our principal here at Mansfield, Helen Mountfield, who is out of the country this week, but who wanted to ensure that we commemorate this solemn day here at Mansfield with a talk from a figure as eminent as Professor David Feldman. I'll introduce David more in just a moment, but I just wanted to begin by thanking you for making the effort to be here. I'm sure we'll hear, or I hope we'll hear more from David, but Holocaust Memorial Day, as you may or may not know, is not being commemorated as much as it was just 2 years ago. In fact, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust shared their statistics recently to note that commemorations are down by as much as 60% in secondary schools against 2 years ago. There seems to be a nervousness to broach this topic, particularly in the divisive climate that we are living in. And yet, commemorating the Shoah, discussing how we remember the Holocaust, and understanding the anti-Semitism and the racism that motivated it are more and more important as the years pass. So, to begin, thank you for being here. And thank you especially to our speaker this evening who can help us navigate this topic in our turbulent times. Professor David Feldman is director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Antisemitism and a professor of history. He joined Birkbeck in 1994, and he previously held lectureships at Christ College, Cambridge, and the University of Bristol. He specializes in the history of anti-Semitism, Jewish history, the history of racialization, and the history of migration into modern Britain. And in addition to his work as a historian, he's actively engaged in research which addresses public policy, so a very good fit here at Mansfield. He's advised the UN, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Human Rights Watch, and in the UK, the All-Party Parliamentary Group Against Anti-Semitism, the Labour Party, and the Football Association. I hope you've come across his writing. He writes widely and in many popular publications, and his most recent book with Mark Volovici is Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and the Politics of Definition. I'd also like just to take a moment to introduce our own Professor Matt Cook. Matt is the Jonathan Cooper Chair of the History of Sexuality, and he will be hosting this evening with me. I have chapel to lead at 6 p.m., so I will be probably having to leave just a little bit early to host that service. So a big thank you to Matt for hosting our Q&A. Please do bring your questions after we hear from Professor Feldman. We're looking forward to hearing what he has to say on this important day, this important week, and to hear your questions back. So thank you, David.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. I have the most minimal of minimal PowerPoint presentations, but in our preparation before getting going, I omitted to ask how I move that slide to the next one. There, that's fine. And that's not very good. Oh dear. I have a screen in front of me. I'm sorry. We go from the beginning. That's great. Okay. And hopefully I'll be able to move it on when I need to move it on. On the 25th of May, 1943, on page 3, the Times reported on what it called a pogrom in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the eyes of the newspaper's editorial staff, the event was newsworthy, but held no special significance. They placed the report beneath items dealing with railway construction in North Africa and the celebration of Empire Day in Egypt and Australia. Nevertheless, the Times here revealed the substance of 2 letters received in London and signed on behalf of the Central Committee of Jewish Labour, the Bund, and by the Jewish National Committee in Poland. The letters recorded that 40,000 Jews remained in Warsaw, a city which in 1939 had contained a Jewish population of more than 350,000. The first letter, dated the 28th of April, chronicled, "Today is the 9th day that the ghetto fights back." Jewish combatants had set alight stores and factories. They had killed and wounded 1,000 of the enemy. The SS and Wehrmacht employed high explosive and incendiary bombs and blasted blocks of houses where there was resistance. The letter continued, "Men, women, and children who are not burnt alive are murdered en masse." The second letter, written on the 11th of May, recorded that resistance was nearing its end. Within days, the revolt had been overpowered. A few of the remaining Jews escaped to the Aryan side of Warsaw. Most were murdered in camps. Commemoration of these events did not await the defeat of the Third Reich. Just 1 year later, there were synagogue services across Britain to remember what was called the Warsaw Ghetto Battle. In London, speakers at a meeting in Holborn, organized by the General Jewish Labour Bund in Poland, invoked the class solidarity of Polish and Jewish workers. They presented Jewish resistance as a component of Polish patriotism. Emanuel Scherer, a representative of the Bund on the Polish National Council, said the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto went to the battle to defend their Warsaw and their soil. At Bevis Marks Synagogue in the City of London, the chief rabbi, Joseph Hertz, a long-standing Zionist, delivered a different message. He placed the Battle of Warsaw in the longue durée of Jewish history and suffering, which recalled the glory of the Maccabees and the self-slaughter at Masada. In Hertz's account, the martyrs at Warsaw did not die for a socialist future in Poland, but for the honor of their people, the Jewish people. He went on to draw attention to the indifference of the larger public, who he said remained unmoved by this crucifixion of a whole people. Hertz excoriated the silence of the leaders of British Jewry, chastising them for their reluctance to protest publicly against a cataclysm that threatened to engulf half the Jewish race. I want to draw out 3 points from this episode. First, in 1943-44, the mass murder of Europe's Jews had not yet been isolated as a discrete unit of history, let alone an event invested with unique moral and historical significance. The terms Chorban, Holocaust, and Shoah, the words employed in post-war decades in Yiddish, English, and Hebrew to encapsulate the campaign of persecution and mass murder, had not yet achieved widespread currency. Instead, we find people struggling to find words and concepts to capture the unfolding horror. When Hertz referred to a crucifixion of a whole people, he drew from a vocabulary most associated with the origins of Christianity. The Times wrote about a pogrom, a term that falls short, not least because we associate it with popular violence, not the orchestrated force of state power. My second point is that from the very beginning, the question of how to understand the persecution and murder of Jews was divisive. Should British Jews promote awareness of the dire situation of European Jewry? Or should they keep silent and devote themselves to the Allied cause? Was resistance in Warsaw a Polish story or a Jewish story? Did it confirm the imperative to struggle for a socialist future in Poland or a Zionist future in Palestine? The contention we encounter today between universalist and particularist perspectives on the meaning of the Holocaust, and which has infused public debate since the 7th of October 2023, has its origins in the early 1940s. Third, seen from the vantage point of the present, this episode highlights that we are dealing with a history of change. Today, the Holocaust occupies a prominent place in public discourse and in the minds of British political leaders. The Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat political parties are all committed to building a Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre on land next to the Houses of Parliament. The British government funds visits to Poland in the expectation that school children will learn lessons from Auschwitz. And lessons from Auschwitz means lessons from the Holocaust. The most notorious of all the Nazi camps is used in everyday speech to represent the Nazis' war against the Jews as a whole. Finally, Holocaust survivors are given a special function promoting Holocaust consciousness and memorialization. It was not always like this. It is only since the 1980s and 90s that survivors and survivor testimony have become central to our understanding of the history of the Holocaust and to its memorialization. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, it was not Auschwitz, but the resistance of Jews in Warsaw that stood at the center of Holocaust memorialization. Above all, the great moral and political significance of the Holocaust in British culture, in British public culture, is an innovation that dates only to the end of the 20th century. In the remainder of this talk, I want to focus on how our conception of the campaign of persecution and murder aimed at Europe's Jews has changed in the post-war decades, and with what consequences for our capacity to understand the past, to contribute to a better future, and to live up to the maxim, never again. In the 1950s, memorialization of the Holocaust by British Jews was fragmented and inward-looking. In 1953, the 10th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there were 4 separate commemorative events in London, organized by the Polish Jewish Ex-Servicemen's Association, the Friends of Yiddish, by Poalet Zion, and by the Jewish Socialist Organization of Great Britain. These were occasions designed to remember the heroism of Jewish resistance fighters and the martyrdom of millions of Jews. They provided moments to mourn, to express ideological convictions, and voice grievances. In 1954, the chairman of the British Zionist Federation set forward a vision of historical change at scale in which the Jewish rising in Warsaw, he said, marked the end of the era of Choban, destruction, just as Israel's Independence Day marked the beginning of a new period in Jewish life. In 1959, speaking in Yiddish, Shmuel Levenberg, a veteran Labour Zionist, reproached Western Jewry for not taking part in the commemoration. He questioned accusingly, where are the official representatives of English Jewry? Where is the English youth? In the early 1960s, commemoration underwent far-reaching change. The foundations were laid inadvertently in Israel. In 1959, the Knesset passed a law for a day of remembrance of Holocaust and heroism on the 27th day of Nisan in the Jewish calendar, a date close to the final phase of resistance in Warsaw. Without intending to do so, Israel's legislators paved the way for new commemorative initiatives outside the country. The second way in which Israel created conditions for a new sort of memorialization elsewhere was through the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960 and his trial and execution in Israel in 1961 and 62. For a while, these events captured the attention of Jewish and non-Jewish publics globally. They provided the context in which a coalition of Jewish organizations transformed Holocaust commemoration in London. In 1960, diverse organizations that had previously organized separate memorial events joined together. By 1961, the consolidated commemoration presented a contrast to the disjointed and insular gatherings of the previous decade. The memorial event itself now took place in a West End venue, usually a theatre, which could accommodate up to 2,000 people. The occasions were marked by displays of martial and religious solemnity. A procession of the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen and Women, standard bearers, the beat of drummers from the Jewish Lads Brigade. There was lighting of 6 memorial candles, one for each 6 million murdered. The London Jewish Male Voice Choir sang Zog nit kein Mol, Never Say, an anthem of defiance and hope inspired by the revolt in Warsaw, composed in the Vilna ghetto and adopted by Jewish partisans elsewhere. Finally, there were commemorative prayers and Kaddish, a prayer associated not only but especially with mourning. Much of the audience at these events comprised Jewish survivors and their families. Now, however, commemoration also addressed the non-Jewish world, whose interest had been aroused by Eichmann's capture and trial. Speakers at these events included eminent non-Jews, as well as Jewish leaders. In 1962, David Astor, the editor of the Observer newspaper, delivered the main address. He set out his universalist and redemptive understanding of the significance of the Nazi persecution of European Jewry. It was, he said, a manifestation of man's capacity to destroy his fellow beings without a rational motive. His universalism was thoroughgoing. The fate of the Jews under Nazi rule should be studied, he proposed, as one example, albeit by far the worst, of a widespread human phenomenon. Astor called for the establishment of a center of studies of what might be called political psychopathology. That would be a worthy monument to the 6 million murdered Jews. And 4 years later, he helped establish the Columbus Center at the University of Sussex, which bore a close resemblance to this prototype. In 1965, when the Labour government began to legislate against racial discrimination, the universalist interpretation of Nazi persecution acquired a more precise political form. Elwyn Jones, the Labour Attorney General, reflected that it was not only the honor of Jewish people that had been vindicated in the Warsaw Ghetto, it was the dignity of man himself, regardless of race or color or creed. This was a pointed statement uttered shortly before the second reading of the government's first race relations bill, legislation intended to prohibit race discrimination in public places and which designated incitement to racial hatred as a crime. Speaking the following year, Reg Friesen, the Jewish Labour MP for Willesden East, yoked Jewish resistance in Warsaw to the Third Reich, to what he conceived as the obligation of Jewish people to resist racism in the present. When a fascist thug hits a colored man, he hits a Jew, Friesen insisted. So in the early and mid-1960s, the Warsaw Ghetto remained at the center of Holocaust memorialization. but memorialisation now addressed non-Jews as well as Jews. It was not only about mourning and Jewish martyrdom, but also forward-looking, intended to promote a world free from race prejudice and discrimination. Despite these changes, the path that leads from Holocaust commemoration in the mid-1960s to the present is a crooked one. Even in the early 1960s, commemoration events did not speak with a single voice. There was a gulf between the visions articulated by Astor and Jones and the words employed in 1964 by David Kupferman, chairman of the Polish Ex-Servicemen's Association. Rather than look to a better future, his focus remained on the past and the blame which belonged to the whole German nation. In 1966, the vice chairman of the association reflected, "We cannot forget the murder of our fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, the murder of our own flesh and blood." For many survivors, this was a specifically Polish-Jewish event and a moment for irreparable grief. Universalism proved a fragile ideal and was further dented by the war in 1967 between Israel and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. There was a surge of Zionist pride among many Jews in Britain. In the aftermath, Jewish minorities in Poland and Iraq were victims of state persecution. Events held to commemorate the Warsaw Uprising reflected these developments. In 1968, the Polish ambassador did not receive an invitation. The president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Michael Fidler, who would become a Conservative MP in 1970, eschewed the language of progressive universalism. Instead, his emphasis was defensive and particularist. He called on British Jewry not to remain silent in the face of the threat to Israel's security or in the face of persecution of Jewish communities in foreign lands. In the 1970s, not only was the universalist impulse in retreat, but also Holocaust commemoration appeared to be a specifically Jewish vocation. In 1979, when the Board of Deputies of British Jews asked Mrs. Thatcher's Conservative government for permission to erect a Holocaust memorial close to the cenotaph, they received a chilly response. In Cabinet, the strongest objections came from the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, who saw no reason why land owned by the Crown should be used to memorialise events which did not take place on British territory and had not involved a large part of the British population. In other words, as late as the 1980s, so far as the British government was concerned, Holocaust memorialisation was not part of the national story, and it held no universal meaning. Yet 2 decades later, in the early 21st century, Holocaust memorialisation formed a rare point of consensus in Britain's fracturing political culture. In 2001, the Blair-led Labour government declared the first UK Holocaust Memorial Day. In 2014, the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, with cross-party support, established a Holocaust Commission to ensure, I quote, that the memory and the lessons of the Holocaust are never forgotten and that the legacy of the survivors lives on for generation after generation. The report further declared that the memory and the lessons of the Holocaust lie at the heart of Britain's values as a nation. How then did we travel from the indifference of the 1980s to the status given to Holocaust Memorial Day in the 21st century? And why did Holocaust commemoration acquire new emphases and patterns so different from those present in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? Although today the UK has become a world leader promoting Holocaust commemoration, the country arrived late to the project. relative to some others. For this reason, the shape of commemoration in the UK has been strongly influenced by tendencies that first developed elsewhere. And I want to highlight 3 interrelated transnational developments which together transform the content of Holocaust commemoration and Holocaust consciousness in this country. One of these changes concerns the shift from Warsaw to Auschwitz as the focus of commemoration. The US-made miniseries Holocaust, screened by the BBC in September 1978, was both a symptom and a motor of this change. A global media event starring Meryl Streep, among others, the series tells the story of a fictional Jewish family, Joseph Weiss, a successful Berlin doctor, and his wife and children. It charts their journey from bourgeois affluence to the gas chambers. A parallel story focuses on Erich Dorf, an unemployed lawyer who enrolls in the SS and becomes an agent of the Nazis' war against the Jews. Auschwitz is the terminus for both of these fictional narratives. Over the next 2 decades, the place of Auschwitz in the Holocaust narrative was consolidated by historians writing in English and by influential social theorists who argued that the mass production of death at Auschwitz was an encapsulation of the dark side, even the essence of modernity. When Holocaust Memorial Day was inaugurated in Britain at the beginning of the 21st century, it was the liberation of Auschwitz, not the Warsaw Revolt, that was chosen for the commemorative date. A second development concerns the authority of survivors and their testimony. Here, the Romanian-born Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel was influential. In 1944, at the age of 15, Wiesel was deported to Auschwitz. He survived. In 1956, he published a memoir in Yiddish, Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world was silent. It described Wiesel's experiences during the Holocaust. The memoir was republished in French in 1958 and in English in 1960, but now without its original accusatory title. The book was repackaged as La Nuit, or Night. From this time, Wiesel repeatedly expressed the idea that the Holocaust is an unknowable event beyond representation. It transcends history, he argues. Auschwitz, he wrote in 1975, defies literature as it defies all literature and systems. Its truth remained hidden in ashes. The Holocaust, Wiesel maintained, was a sacred event, akin to the revelation at Sinai. If the Holocaust is sacred and beyond representation by historians and novelists, then, as Tony Lerman and Zoe Waxman have argued, all that remains is for survivors to bear witness. Their testimony provides access to a transcendent mystery which otherwise eludes anyone who did not themselves experience the horror. Wiesel made these claims in the 60s and 70s, but it was only in the 1980s and still more in the 90s that they took institutional form. In part, this development was closely related to the new focus on Auschwitz. As those of you who have visited Auschwitz-Birkenau will know, the place was a vast complex. It was a labor camp as well as a death factory. As a result, there were many more survivors from Auschwitz than there were from those camps devoted solely to murder, and more than from Warsaw. At the end of the 20th century, there was an efflorescence of projects designed to capture the testimony of Holocaust survivors. More than this, henceforth, survivor testimony became a fulcrum of Holocaust memorialization. One initiative was the Fortunoff Archive in New Haven, Connecticut, which began in 1979 as a project videotaping survivors who were encouraged to structure and tell their own stories. By 1995, it had collected 3,600 testimonies and was housed at Yale University. The survivors of the Shoah Visual Foundation, launched in 1995 by Steven Spielberg, has followed a different path. The interviews are highly structured, and the explicit goal of the foundation is didactic. In this case, testimony is intended to teach racial, ethnic, and cultural tolerance and provide a resource with which to resist anti-Semitism. And we can see here the imprint of different influences. In part, they reflected the democratization of history writing and research and the rise of oral history more broadly. At the Fortunoff Archive, therapeutic approaches to testimony have been influential. The benefits of testimony are seen to accrue to survivors themselves, as well as to posterity. However, as the Spielberg Initiative suggests, for some influential figures, survivor testimony was now invested with a pedagogic function. Fueled by the conviction that the Holocaust was a terrible mystery which could only be apprehended through an encounter with survivor testimony, growing numbers believed that this encounter could make the world a better and safer place. The third and related change in the late 20th century was that the words Holocaust and Shoah became commonplace as the terms employed to describe Nazi Germany's war against the Jews. The rise of the word Holocaust began in the 1960s, spurred by Wiesel's memoir and the Eichmann trial. But you can see from this engram how usage of the word took off in the 1980s and 90s. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum opened in 1993. In 2000, the Imperial War Museum in London opened its own dedicated Holocaust exhibition. The Holocaust was now well and truly established as a discrete unit of history. The term Shoah, meaning disaster or ruin in Hebrew, originates in the Bible and was a word used in the Hebrew press in Palestine in the 1930s to describe events in Germany. However, as a synonym for the Holocaust, the word was popularized by Claude Lanzmann, whose film Shoah appeared in 1985. By 1985, the term Holocaust had been extended to apply to the persecution of victims other than Jews, Roma and Sinti, homosexuals, people with disabilities. Using the Hebrew term Shoah pushed back against this tendency. Lanzmann chose the term because he wanted to emphasize what he conceived as the singular fate of Jewish people under Nazi rule and how it could not be represented in language. In words that might have been uttered by Wiesel, Lanzmann explained himself as follows: the word Shoah occurred to me one night because, not speaking Hebrew, Shoah was a signifier with no signified, a brief, opaque utterance, an impenetrable, unspeakable word. And here is another engram for you to feast your eyes on. And again, you see the way in which the usage of the term Shoah moves up through the 1980s and 1990s. Holocaust consciousness came late to the UK, but when it did arrive, it was in a blaze of activity. After the election in 1997, the Labour government, headed by Tony Blair, called for a renewal of citizenship at home. New Labour came to believe the Holocaust should play a central role in civic education. It was in this context that it introduced Holocaust Memorial Day in 2001. This focus on the Holocaust was in part an outgrowth of work undertaken by the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research, created in 1998 on the initiative of the Swedish Prime Minister, Göran Persson, with the support of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. The task force was an initiative from centrist political leaders in the aftermath of the Cold War. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union and other communist states, and in the wake of German reunification, Holocaust memory played a strategic role in the ideological reconstruction of Western Europe and of West European democracy, and the conception of a new and unified Europe. In 2004, Romano Prodi, then president of the European Commission, stated, "The horror of the Shoah deeply marked Europe's founding fathers." In fact, the 1957 Treaty of Rome, the EU's founding document, makes no mention of the annihilation of Europe's Jews, but it is Prodi's rewriting of history that matters. The Holocaust and the defeat of Nazi Germany had become the foundational events from which democratic Europe now drew legitimacy. Within the task force, it was Britain which brought forward the proposal to designate a day of remembrance for Holocaust victims. Blair declared the Holocaust deserves a permanent place in our collective memory. When Holocaust Memorial Day was introduced in 2001, an information pack was sent to all schools in the country. The aim of the day, the pack explained, was not only to raise awareness and understanding of the Holocaust, but also to highlight the values of a tolerant and diverse society and the responsibility of all citizens. In Britain, as in Europe, the fight against anti-Semitism was now imagined to guarantee human rights and toleration in the present, precisely because post-1945 democracies were built on the defeated ruins of Nazism. But what was being commemorated? Here, the developments of the two previous decades powerfully infused the educational message. The information pack for use on Holocaust Memorial Day did not dwell on the dangers of political power, but rather on the demands of citizenship. Jack Straw, the Home Secretary, explained, "The lessons to be learned are for us all." David Cameron's Holocaust Commission in 2015 reproduced the same rationale for Holocaust commemoration. The prize, we are told, will be empathetic citizens with tolerance for the beliefs and cultures of others. The focus of attention is on individuals. And this even applies to the Holocaust itself, which the Commission presented as the historic expression of unreason and popular prejudice, ultimately a product of 1,000 years of European anti-Semitism. This is a bizarre and decontextualized rendition of the fate of Europe's Jews in the Second World War. To be sure, the Nazis' mass murder of Jews required the participation of tens of thousands and implicated millions. But we should not let slip that the final solution, as it was called, was fundamentally a state-driven project undertaken in circumstances of total war. The trio of developments I've set out, the focus on Auschwitz, on survivor testimony, and the installation of the Holocaust as an event of unique moral and pedagogic significance, all feature centrally in the culture of Holocaust commemoration in the UK today. This was illustrated vividly a year ago by the Prime Minister. In January 2025, Keir Starmer not only put aside time to visit Auschwitz, tick, but also hosted a special gathering of Holocaust survivors, tick, and their descendants at 10 Downing Street. Here we are told he spent time listening to the powerful testimonies of Holocaust survivors. The Prime Minister signed the Holocaust Education Trust Book of Commitment, promising to fight the poison of anti-Semitism and to support Holocaust education so we can not only tackle the root causes of this hatred, but also ensure that never again, tick, means what it says. Holocaust Memorial Day also commemorates millions of non-Jewish victims of Nazi persecution and also some other genocides, those in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur. In this way, the Holocaust has a status that manages to be both unique and paradigmatic. But the current emphases within Holocaust commemoration have had some regrettable consequences. First, they stand in the way of our capacity to properly remember the Holocaust. The attention we devote to Auschwitz comes at a cost to historical accuracy. 1 million were murdered at Auschwitz, but the site's symbolic stature obscures the fact that as many Jews were killed by bullets as by gas. By the end of 1941, the Germans, along with their local allies, had slaughtered 1 million Jews in the Soviet Union and the Baltics, equal to the total number of Jews killed at Auschwitz during the entire war. The history of mass murder was less modern than we sometimes imagine. The status given to witnesses is also problematic. Wiesel wanted Holocaust survivors not only to have a voice, but to be heard. And in this, he was undoubtedly correct, and the attention we pay today is salutary. The problem is not with testimony, but with a particular sort of sacred authority invested in it. After all, survivor testimony is necessarily mediated by post-war experiences and understanding, not least by the survivors' personal experiences and their post hoc understanding that what they lived through constitutes the Shoah or the Holocaust. Second, the content of memorialization too often promotes the mistaken view that by learning lessons from the Holocaust, we will be better able to overcome anti-Semitism and prejudice today. The persistence of anti-Semitism in Britain and the rest of the world presents a grave challenge, all the more so in the wake of killings in Manchester and Sydney. But there is no evidence that Holocaust education helps us understand and confront anti-Semitism today. The most recent academic synthesis of evidence concludes that Holocaust education often fails in conveying knowledge of the Holocaust, much less civic and anti-racist outcomes. Believing otherwise is a form of magical thinking. There are good reasons why school pupils and students should learn about the Holocaust, but confronting anti-Semitism and racism in the present is not one of them. There is also a great need for carefully thought out educational initiatives to combat anti-Semitism and racism, but Holocaust education is not the way to do it. The absence of the state from our understanding of the Holocaust stands in the way of connecting that history to racism in the present. The Cameron government advocated that we learn lessons from the Holocaust. At the same time as it did so, the Conservative-run Home Office presided over the Windrush scandal, which saw thousands of law-abiding Black Britons from the Caribbean classified as illegal immigrants. An unknown number were denied access to paid work and housing. Scores were deported. The Windrush scandal underlines the continuing significance of the state as an agent of racial discrimination and disadvantage, something which the current practice of Holocaust memory serves to obscure. So the mainstream consensus that adheres to Holocaust education and remembrance in the United Kingdom comes with limitations, both as a way of reflecting on the past and as an influence on the present. I've also tried to show that the history of Holocaust consciousness and commemoration is a history of change, and that this has been a contentious history. This emphasis on change and debate is helpful, I believe, as we contemplate Holocaust consciousness and commemoration in our present moment. The Holocaust was invoked repeatedly following the spree of murder, mutilation, and hostage-taking carried out by Hamas and others on October the 7th, 2023. It was, said President Biden and many others, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Benjamin Netanyahu labeled Hamas the new Nazis, as did others. Statements such as these draw strength from the emphases and shortcomings in Holocaust consciousness today, in which we approach Jewish suffering without attention to the context in which it arises and without reference to the exercise of state power that produced it. Hamas's heinous crimes were committed in circumstances in which the relationship of Jewish people to state power was entirely different to the one that led to the Holocaust. In Israel-Palestine, there is a history and current practice of discrimination, displacement, and dispossession in which Jewish people on this occasion are the beneficiaries. The invocation of the evils of Nazis and the Holocaust has helped to obscure this continuing process. It has opened the way to saying that any response to October the 7th by Israel, however punitive, whatever its impact on the civilian population, could be justified. Arguably, invocations of the Holocaust, by presenting the Hamas attack as an existential threat, have been an enabling factor in Israel's war on Gaza. That catastrophic onslaught has produced tens of thousands of civilian deaths, displacement, and disease and privation. Israel and some of its leaders find themselves accused of war crimes. Israel, the Jewish state, itself is accused of genocide. Israel's former foreign minister, Shlomo Ben-Ami, himself a historian, wrote in Haaretz in August last year, Israel is committing atrocities that may remain a mark of Cain on the forehead of the Jewish state for years to come. Is it possible, he asks, that the people who endured the Holocaust are now committing the most heinous of crimes, genocide, against their neighbors? The accusation of genocide brought against Israel inevitably evokes the Holocaust, which is instated as the archetype of genocide. And the accusation is made by some of the most eminent Holocaust historians, including Omer Bartov and Amos Goldberg. Other historians defend Israel's war on Gaza as a war of defense. They've been supported by Danny Dayan, the chair of Yad Vashem, and by Stuart Eisenstadt, the chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the two most significant institutions in the world dedicated to Holocaust memory. For all these reasons, debate over Israel's war on Gaza impinges powerfully on Holocaust consciousness and commemoration, sometimes intimately so. As some of you may know, last month a worker with the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust in Scotland had her contract terminated on account of her active support for Standing Together, a grassroots movement organizing Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel against the occupation and for peace, equality, and social justice. The reason given for the dismissal is that Standing Together has accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. Melanie Goldberg's stance reflects wider efforts by activists to connect Holocaust memorialization to a broader understanding of what never again should mean. Similar work is undertaken by scholars such as Brian Chayette, Ezra Osiorek, and Michael Rothberg, all of whom explore the multi-directional connections between Holocaust memory and anti-colonial struggles and anti-racist movements. Today, there is no consensus over what our purpose is or should be when we remember and study the Holocaust. The meaning of the Holocaust and how we should respond to it was a contentious subject from the very beginning, present in responses to the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. In the past, as today, there was a tension between the universal and particular understandings of the fate of Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis and their allies. Today, it seems to me, our disagreements over what never again means are irresoluble. They reflect a fundamental clash of values and of principles. They illustrate that history writing and commemoration is a conversation between the past and the present, in which the present will always have the last word. But insofar as our debates are connected to the past and to the disagreements of those who have gone before us, we can at least say they honor that past. And in the context of Holocaust Memorial Day, that may just be enough. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, David. Join us in that. Thanks so much, David. What an incredible lecture. Revelatory, I think, in the way that you opened out the meanings, texture, and trajectory of memorialisation, and this relationship to statehood and the state, I think, is incredibly something I hadn't thought about. And I think it obviously kind of is a key, I think, to thinking about these issues. We've got about sort of 5 or 10 minutes to gather comments and questions for David. So if you'd like to just stick your hand up, and we've got some roaming microphones. Could we?
I speak as a member of Mansfield College, and I'm somewhat surprised that, this is a Christian foundation, like most Oxford colleges. Never once did you mention the Christian church. Now, surely, to go back to fundamentals, if the churches in Germany, Christians in Germany, the Christians in Poland, and the Christians in England had said very loud and clear, Jesus Christ is a Jew, anti-Semitism would never have got off the ground.
Do you want to gather some up, or do you want to take?
Let's gather 2 or 3.
Yeah, we've got it. Thank you very much. We're going to gather a couple more questions, and then Sarah up at the top there.
So thank you so much for such a thoughtful talk. And it reminded me of the ways in which Holocaust studies are so often a place that we go to as a resource in other places in the humanities. So I wanted to ask a question from those other places. I was really intrigued by your observation about 2/3 of the way through that there is not, in fact, evidence that Holocaust education has any positive effect. And I find that really compelling as a feminist who has been committed to a praxis in which visibilizing features of the past, we presume, has some kind of positive effect in the here and now. And so I'm wondering if you could just pick up that question of what we can and we cannot expect as scholars in the humanities of visibilizing phenomenon and generalize from the particular part of your field that seems most relevant to that.
Thanks, Sarah. We had one more, I think, at the back, or 2 more at the back. Let's gather those, and then we'll come back to David.
Thank you very much. That was a really illuminating talk. I was just wondering how Holocaust denial has a role in your narrative.
I think we had one more there, yeah. Thank you.
You mentioned how survivors have a unique and special duty of bearing witness. And my question is, what should we do as a world, a country, or as individuals when the last remaining Holocaust survivor dies?
I didn't catch that. Could you repeat?
What should we do when the last Holocaust survivor dies?
Okay.
In terms of bearing witness. Thank you so much for those thoughts and questions, David.
Okay. I'll go backwards. The question of what to do, the idea that there should be, that the inevitable waning number of Holocaust survivors, and eventually the fact that there will be no survivors left, the idea that that would produce a crisis in Holocaust commemoration is, it's only possible to think that if one agrees with Wiesel and others that their testimony, that without their presence, we cannot understand, comprehend, appreciate the Holocaust. That's not something with which I agree, although obviously their testimony greatly adds to our understanding, but we already have that. But some institutions try to face that issue because they so believe in the importance of the figure of the survivor by creating holograms, but by creating virtual survivors, and that visitors to those institutions ask questions, and with AI, answers come. But as we know with AI, the answers to the questions are not always the answer to the question that you posed. So, in other words, some people are addressing that as an urgent problem, but personally, I don't think the problem is that urgent. Holocaust denial, in a sense, I have a similar answer in the sense that I think that Holocaust denial remains a fringe phenomenon. What is a much more important phenomenon is indifference and the sort of confusion which Nathan was talking about in his introduction that has led to the massive drop-off in schools doing anything on Holocaust Memorial Day. And I think that the way forward there is about us having a much clearer sense of what remembering and teaching the Holocaust can and can't do. And I'll say more about that in response to the in response to the second question. So I do think that that the past has something to offer if we want to teach about racism, if we want to teach about anti-Semitism. My institute runs a course called Facing Anti-Semitism that we deliver to trade unions, media organizations, professional associations. But part of the problem with the way in which the Holocaust is used is that it is seen as an encapsulation of anti-Semitism, when it's patently not the case, because most anti-Semitism has not been violent, let alone murderous, let alone murderous to the, in the order of millions. Most of it is denigration, discrimination, harassment. That's what everyday anti-Semitism looks like. And it does come from a store of narratives and stereotypes which have built up in Western culture, above all in European culture, since the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. It's what colleagues and I have called a reservoir of stereotypes and narratives, which is part of our common culture, which people can draw on, but whose presence can only be understood historically. So I do think history has a role to play, which brings me to the final question, which is that, of course, it was the churches, above all, that produced these stereotypes and myths. So I could have spoken about the churches, but I was talking about Holocaust commemoration. But in all honesty, I'm not very surprised that the churches remained silent in the 1930s and 1940s, by and large. Some did amazing work. Some individuals and the Quakers and so forth. So I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. But insofar as the longue durée understanding of the Holocaust has a point, the contribution of Christianity there was immense.
We've got time for another round of comments and questions. We'll gather up another 3 or 4, and I might add one as well.
David, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk, very thought-provoking talk. I just have one question, really, which is, could you clarify then whether you are arguing for a separation of Holocaust memorialisation and education about anti-Semitism, combating anti-Semitism? I just want to be clear that I've understood what you were saying on that.
Thanks very much. Mary Beth.
Thank you, David. That was amazing. This is a very big question, so feel free to ignore it. And I don't know that I can even articulate it very well, but I wondered if you could, you did a bit already, but gesture at the kind of scope and work done by the term genocide in this history, and how that has kind of ebbed and flowed and now flowed again to kind of interact with the history that you're tracing.
Thanks. And just behind.
Yes, thanks for the talk. It gave me loads of new ideas about it that I hadn't had before. And I was wondering, coming from a school, what advice you might have for us about how we do bring these various dialogues together. I think it's really important that we think about how to not only memorialise the Holocaust and its all of its implications, but the other things you were saying, I think, about the inevitable comparisons to state control and state-imposed racism that pupils are aware of today.
Mm-hmm. Did we have one more? I thought up at there. Have we got one more? Alison.
Thank you. Well, that was a fighting talk and a brilliant lecture, a very brave lecture, I thought. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, so again, sorry, it might not be worth commenting on, but I wanted just to go back to the Warsaw Ghetto and the commemoration in the 50s from the Bund and the kind of socialist moment, because when you were talking about state, quite rightly in my view, about state power being absent from the moral universalizing narratives, it's also important to think about the state from below, as it were, and the ways in which people generate anti-Semitism and can indeed recognize it and combat it through other forms of identification, so that the state's not simply about control and power. You know, one can come at it from below to think about the state as something that can be challenged through other forms of knitting together, which is what the Bund felt. And I suppose my question was, what happened to that? I mean, you can't answer it, David, but it's so alien now to think about that moment, the Polish Jewish socialist moment,
Yes.
which shifts you away from anti-racism in a very particular form.
Yes.
Thanks, Alison. I'm going to hold back because there's enough for us to reflect on. David.
Okay, so I'll try and go in order. So, Rebecca, I am saying that I would argue for a separation of memorialisation from combating anti-Semitism, although from education to combat anti-Semitism, although of course not a total separation, but so it's important that people know about the Holocaust as the most dreadful way in which anti-Semitism ever manifested itself. And also that if one wants to understand the Holocaust, then this isn't about some vague, sort of nebulous notion of evil. It was motivated. The Nazi war against the Jews was imagined by the Nazis as a defensive war. It seems incredible to us. But they believed that Jews held this immense conspiratorial power that would undo Germany. And the connection of Jews to Bolshevism then, which was a commonplace conservative idea from the Russian Revolution through to the end of the 1940s at least, and still lives on in some ways. And that idea, and the idea of a Jewish conspiracy, and the idea of a Jewish conspiracy, of Jewish conspiratorial power, is absolutely central to the way in which anti-Semitism as a set of ideas works. And the Holocaust is one particular example of that. So that's how I would bring the two together. Genocide, Mary Beth, thank you. So I think the simple answer is that I don't know, but I'll give a couple of thoughts. One is the way it would be very interesting to know when genocide was instated as the crime of crimes. When the famous ITV series on the World at War was, with its soundtrack from Laurence Olivier, it had one episode which it called Genocide. And that was in 1974. That's interesting, partly because it shows how, in 1974, what happened to the Jews was an add-on. It was another episode. It wasn't a subject in itself. But it was called genocide then. Obviously, the term genocide today, over whether it captures what Israel has perpetrated in Gaza, is deeply controversial. What I briefly want to say about that is that the word is clearly used in different ways. On the one hand, it has a very precise legal meaning. And on the other hand, people use the term to express the way in which they perceive that what Israel has done in Gaza is more than war. And the term is meant to capture that. But I'm personally, I have reservations about the term as the crime of crimes, because it is reserved for crimes against a people. And so attempts to obliterate, murder political minorities, sexual minorities, don't easily fall under that label. I think it restricts us, although clearly in other ways it's enabling because of the term's great political resonance. And that's the best I can do, I'm afraid. What to do in schools? I'm a historian. I think the Holocaust should be taught as a part of history. It should be taught as a part of the history of the Second World War. And that, which isn't to say that issues around racism and anti-Semitism and citizenship also shouldn't be taught, but the two should not be, in my view, it's not helpful to conflate the two. And what happened to the Bund? Well, in some ways, it lived on. It lived on in the small band that formed the Jewish Socialist Group in the 1970s in London. The people who taught them, who weren't brought up with Yiddish, who taught themselves Yiddish. The way, I mean, a part of your question is about the ways in which East European Jews experienced upward mobility and assimilated. But today, the Bund is an inspiration to the many young Jewish people who, some march, some don't march, but who protest and are appalled by Israel's actions. And it remains a cultural and a political presence today. Sometimes it produces bad history, and people forget that the Bund, in their own way, were ethnic nationalists, but at the same time, it's a history which does remain an inspiration.
Thank you. Can I slip a question under the wire, and then we'll close the evening. But I'm really interested. I was really taken with this moment in the, I think you identify in the late 90s, around maybe the strategic deployment of the Holocaust memorialisation in the service of British values and ideas of Britishness. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about those putative values, but also what was why then? I mean, what was, what were the British values that didn't quite match earlier, that meant that the Holocaust wasn't grasped in the same way?
Earlier, in 1979, when the project came into Thatcher's government, British values were about the memory of the war, the welfare state was widely seen as a product, understood as a product and as a reward to the people for their service in the war. Obviously, Thatcher's government had a complicated relationship to that, but it was still there. And it was in the context of the Cold War. So something about Carrington, which I didn't mention, is that he thought we don't want to offend the Federal Republic of Germany by remembering this awkward history. It's really important. I think it's important to remember the sort of Blair moment. That Britain, this was a moment of high Europeanism in Britain, in British politics. So I think what we were doing was very much being pulled along, or not pulled along, but in parallel with what had happened in Europe. So remembering the Holocaust became very important in Europe after the end of the Cold War, so that anti-communism was no longer the legitimating force that it had been. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, and sort of as Tony Judt wrote, that Holocaust remembrance became the entry ticket into European civilization for the new nation states in Eastern Europe, and of course in the wake of German reunification. So Britain was responding to that European moment. However, by the time of the Cameron Commission in 2015, it was not a high European moment. These were British values. It seems to me then it was a great convenience that Britain was marking someone else's atrocity. That's one of the great virtues of Holocaust commemoration in this country, that we don't think about our own genocide in Tasmania. We don't think about enslavement and the slave trade. We think about what Germany and its allies did to the Jews. And I had an encounter with this, sort of, as it were, up close and almost personal, when through a bunch of circumstances, I ended up giving evidence to Cameron's commission. And I sort of said, well, Britain's role in the Holocaust wasn't all that wonderful, and it allowed many refugees to enter the country, but it also kept many out, and it kept many out of Palestine, and it's a complicated history. And I also said that there are other minorities in this country whose Irish minorities from the Caribbean, whose relationship to the British state was not always a happy one, to say the least, and that having a Holocaust, a commemoration which didn't also acknowledge this other history, was going to be seen as problematic and actually might not bring any benefit to the Jews, to Jewish people in the long run. So they didn't particularly like hearing that. But as I left, someone who I believe was the sort of leading inspiration behind Cameron's commission said, but don't you think this should be a moment of national celebration? National celebration, because Britain managed not to kill 6 million Jews. So at that point, it wasn't part of a European phenomenon. At that point, it was becoming a sort of a British, a more inward-looking, which was trying to use the history of the war to say, look, we're different from them.
An exceptionalism,
yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. And thanks so much for helping us, guiding us, helping us think through these actually incredibly urgent issues around memorialisation of the Holocaust and Holocaust Memorial Day. It's been a real honour to hear you speak and to have you here at Mansfield. Will you join me in thanking David Feldman?